Hello, my name is Carlo Bouillon. I am a graduate assistant with the Transnational NGO Initiative. I have the pleasure to undertake a brief career interview with James Crowley, who is an associate with Accenture Development Partnerships and former senior partner with Accenture. Thank you very much for joining us here today.
It's a pleasure.
So first, I'd like to ask you, could you please describe or give a brief explanation of your work as an INGO consultant?
I work mainly with the international NGOs, mainly the larger ones, even though increasingly I'm enjoying working with the very small ones as a contrast. But the nature of the work breaks down to three main types, I guess. One is helping them through strategic planning processes for the large international NGOs, which is quite an intensive and quite an emotional roller coaster that they go through every 5 years, very often, to make decisions on priorities and investments and goals for the coming years. The second, I guess, category is around what I would call organizational strengthening or performance improvement or restructuring kind of work, which is for international NGOs, helping them to get more joined up or more aligned or more coherent and just higher performing as global organizations. This kind of work I've done with CARE and with Plan and with various organizations. And the third is slightly different in that it's trying to join the dots between the development programs of NGOs and the private sector, particularly the large private sector organizations who are increasingly taking an interest in with their core businesses and getting involved in developing countries. In the old days, they would have seen it as a CSR thing or about giving money, but increasingly it's about new markets and new sources of operations and opportunities for them.
Could you briefly describe your own career path? So you were once a senior partner with Accenture, and then you became a INGO consultant. Could you briefly describe how your career path and also some of the differences between consulting private companies compared to INGOs?
My career is like a dinner menu. It's got a starter, main course, dessert, and then aperitif or liqueur at the end. My starter was engineering, 4 years, which kind of got me off the ground. My main course was consulting with Accenture for the private sector, 17 or 18 years. The NGO work is like the dessert, which is the really interesting and tasty bit, which can go on for quite a long time. And after that is something else. But I quite enjoy it a lot. The transition from one to the other was, I can say, was completely planned. Going from engineering to management consulting through an MBA was a very impulsive choice I took back in the 80s. Going from management consulting and the commercial side to the INGO world was much more deliberate. I knew I wanted to do something a bit different that built on my skills and built on my experience, but was a little bit more worthwhile and also a bit more challenging. And at that point, also probably on the lifestyle, I wanted to avoid being on a plane every week for 2 or 3 goes, because my kids were still reasonably young. So the combination of factors. But in some ways, the work with international development organizations is similar in that I'm strategic planning or organizational strengthening or performance improvement is for World Vision versus Shell. A lot of similarities. It's a big organization with lots of common issues. On the other hand, the context in which it works, it is very different because how you make interventions in international development or in humanitarian work that are very effective is quite challenging, and it requires a lot of thought. And I guess one of the things that really, surprised me when I got into the sector was maybe I expected to find lots of slightly amateurish, good-intentioned people doing mediocre work. What I actually found was lots of very skilled and professional people who were deadly serious about what they did, who had PhDs and masters and degrees in development, and in many cases had devoted their careers to helping those less fortunate in various ways. So I quickly realised that on one hand, the work they did was quite serious professional work, but also realised that the organisations which sat around those people had a lot of progress to make to catch up with how international companies in the private sector manage and operate. And I guess the contribution that I hopefully are trying to bring is in a tiny, tiny, tiny little way, is to try to help to bridge that gap.
So that sounds like very interesting work. And what are some of the INGOs that you've worked for in the past?
I've probably worked for a dozen, or maybe if not more. So the recent ones probably are Tiny, YBI, which is a tiny network on youth entrepreneurship, which is based in UK, but it's a global network of about 50 youth entrepreneurship organisations, which is very, very interesting. Another one is Trade Links, which is a tiny one in out of Ireland, which works in Uganda, Rwanda, to help local enterprise grow and be able to compete for the opportunities out of the oil industry, as well as export and take advantage of local markets in Africa. So they're kind of contrast to the bigger ones like Plan, World Vision, AMREF, which is a medium size, very, very, very interesting organisation because it's run by Africans for Africa, out of Africa, which I love working for them some years back. And people like the International Federation of the Red Cross out of Geneva. We had a goal last year trying to help their global secretariat, which coordinates all the Red Cross organisations around the world, IRC, Rescue Committee, Habitat for Humanity. So quite a good spectrum of them. Increasingly, I'm liking the small ones, surprisingly.
Very interesting. So how is your typical day like? If students want to get in the field of being a consultant for INGOs, what could they expect?
I think one of both the challenges and the joys of consulting is that you have many things going on in your life at once. So very often you've got a project going on, which you're trying to deliver. You've also got discussions about future projects going on to work out what you do next. At the same time, you've got research going on in your head or in reality to help build up new ideas, because people recruit consultants because they have some ideas and thoughts and refreshing inputs into what they're doing. So what you do in a day seems to change a lot depending on which mix of those things you're involved in. Very often if you're working with a client, now it's a bit different because I do, I guess, more advisory work than kind of working with a client 5 days a week, which would have been the case when I was younger in my career. So now I tend to work with a few different organisations in parallel. So I'm either involved in meetings with them, very often in Skype, and calls with them, maybe with them for a week-long workshop like last week in Nairobi. I could be working on, when I was writing my book, a few hours a day for a month, just getting a chapter nailed out in parallel with doing stuff. So it tends to vary a lot.
And did it differ so it differed a bit from working with private to INGOs?
Well, the difference now, because I'm associate and I'm pseudo-independent really, so 95% of my time is actually doing project work or research work.
Okay. Whereas
when I was with Accenture in my latter years, there was a lot of time in, what would you say, the administration, the selling, the managing, the recruiting, the performance management, the hiring, the firing, all those stuff, which probably took up 90% of your time.
Yeah.
So there was very little time for problem solving and real consulting. So the joy of what I do now is that I like the sector a lot, but also I spend 95% of the time doing consulting rather than administration and management.
Very interesting.
By the way, I don't get quite paid the same way, which is a side effect.
Well, as long as you're enjoying what
Yes.
you're doing, that's the important thing, right?
Absolutely.
So for some of the students who may want to be a consultant for INGOs, what is some career advice? What are some of the skills that they should have if they want to do consulting in general, or for INGOs that they may be able to get from the university? And
let me take that one first.
Okay.
Because there's two aspects. I think the first is that understanding development is not enough. So I think people who come to international development as a consultant need to be prepared to bring some expertise into it. So if you're a doctor, you understand development, and you're a doctor. So you bring the medical aspect as well as development aspect together. And I think the challenge for some young graduates who just have a degree in international development means that initially it's hard for them to get off the mark. So one is to have a skill to bring with them. Having said that, I would advise strongly, like we spoke earlier on, of getting out to the field and spending a couple of years volunteering in the field to understand how development works and what the issues are and what the reality is, rather than working in an office in Washington, because it's easier to make it real, and I think it would speed up your career quite a lot to get early field experience.
And in terms of budgeting or perhaps organizational management classes, would you find that helpful for a career in consulting?
I think you'll find if you join a consulting practice, they're much more concerned about your capacity than your actual knowledge, in that they like to find people who are open to learn, who think logically, who think rationally, who are interested in learning, and interested in getting things done. A lot of that stuff you pick up along the way, and they teach you. The one thing I would say is being able to demonstrate. The core skills of consulting are fairly straightforward. It's about being able to add up and do modeling and analysis. It's about communicating, but very importantly, it's about empathy with other people. Because as a consultant, you always work as you don't have any position power. So it's being able to understand where people are coming from, so you can actually feed in ideas, feed in advice, feed in thoughts in a way that has impact.
Thank you. So I think you answered my last question, which is advice you'd like to give the students interested in working in the field is just to be more open-minded and be willing to learn.
Get out in the field.
Get out in the field,
yeah,
and be a problem solver.
Get out in the field and be a problem solver, and be very flexible to make the best of whatever situation you find, even though it might. I think it happens a lot with VSO volunteers, I understand, is that by the time they get to the field, the issue that they thought they were going to help with 6 months ago or a year ago may well have gone away or changed its shape quite a bit. And you find yourself coaching a football team instead of designing a school.
So just being adaptable is important.
Being adaptable and taking advantage of whatever needs to be done.
Understanding the context too is important. Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Crowley, for the interview. This wraps up the questions for the career interview. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.